There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, the familiar quiet of a shared living room, the low murmur of a documentary playing on the television. You don't recognize them as watershed moments until much, much later, when you're looking back and you can see the precise hairline fracture where your life split into a before and an after. For me, that moment smelled like old books and the ozone scent of rain on concrete, and it was shaped by a question. A question that had absolutely nothing, and yet everything, to do with me. He shifted on the couch, the worn leather groaning softly under his weight. Alex had a way of inhabiting a space that was both restless and utterly consuming, a low-grade, kinetic energy that hummed just beneath his skin. He'd been quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the screen but not truly seeing the migrating wildebeest. I knew the signs. His stillness was never restful. It was the calm at the center of a gathering storm, a coiling of thought and anxiety that would eventually need an outlet. I had, over the years, become the primary witness to these storms, the silent keeper of his quiet wreckage. Tonight, the air was particularly heavy. He turned his head, the movement slow, deliberate. The blue light of the television cast shifting shadows across the sharp planes of his face, catching in the slight stubble on his jaw. His eyes, usually a bright, clear hazel that held the spark of some impending joke, were dark and serious. They didn't meet mine. Instead, they fell, tracing a path from my eyes, down the bridge of my nose, and settled, with unnerving focus, on my mouth. The air in my lungs seemed to solidify, turning to glass. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. It was rough around the edges, frayed with an exhaustion that went deeper than just a long day at work. My own voice felt like a stranger in my throat. "Know what, Alex?" He didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed, a tangible pressure against my lips. The documentary faded into a meaningless drone, the entire universe shrinking to the 2 feet of space between us on my worn-out couch. He finally lifted his eyes to mine, and in their depths, I saw a profound and terrifying vulnerability, a raw uncertainty that stripped away all his usual, easy confidence. "How do you know?" he repeated, his voice even quieter, almost a whisper carried on the dust motes dancing in the television's glow. "If you like someone." And in that moment, with his question hanging in the space between us, aimed at my mouth like a loaded confession, the world as I had known it simply ceased to exist. The before had ended. I was now, irrevocably, in the after, and I had no map for the terrain that lay ahead. To understand the sheer, seismic gravity of that question, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was asked. You have to understand the 6 years of history that preceded it, a history built with such careful, platonic architecture that the idea of a romantic wrecking ball was not just unwelcome, it was unthinkable. Alex and I were a fixed point, an immutable law of our own small universe. We met in the way so many people do in their early 20s, through a shared space and a mutual inconvenience. It was a cavernous, slightly damp off-campus house with a rotating cast of student tenants, a place where privacy was a myth and the refrigerator was a constant source of low-stakes warfare. I was the quiet one, the photography student who treated his room like a darkroom and a hermit's cave, emerging only for classes or sustenance. My camera was a shield, a way to observe the world without having to fully participate in it. I documented the chaos of that house, the leaning tower of pizza boxes, the epic arguments over stolen milk, the fleeting, blurry faces of party guests, from a safe, artistic distance. Alex was the opposite. He was a force of nature. A computer science major with the social energy of a golden retriever, he moved through the house like a welcome storm front, all bright smiles and easy laughter. He knew everyone's name, their major, their go-to comfort food. He organized house movie nights and mediated disputes with a cheerful diplomacy that was impossible to resist. He was, in every conceivable way, made of sunlight. I, by contrast, felt I was composed of shadow and silver halide. For the first 2 months, we were just satellites in the same messy orbit. I would see him in the kitchen, charming someone's visiting parents, or hear his booming laugh from the living room. He was a part of the house's vibrant, chaotic landscape that I was merely documenting. I was convinced he barely knew my name. The change came, as it often does, with a crisis. A minor one, but a crisis nonetheless. My final project for a portraiture class was due, a series of 10 prints, and my ancient, second-hand enlarger decided to die in the most dramatic way possible, with a fizz, a pop, and a small puff of acrid smoke. It was 2 in the morning. The prints were due at 9. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I wasn't the type to ask for help. I was the type to suffer in silence, to accept failure as a private, personal shame. I sat on the floor of my makeshift darkroom, the red safe light casting a hellish glow on my face, and just stared at the dead piece of equipment. That was when a soft knock came at my door. I ignored it. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Leo? You in there?" It was Alex's voice, muffled by the door. "Saw the light. Everything okay?" I didn't answer. I just wanted him to go away, to leave me to my quiet despair. But Alex's brand of kindness was persistent. The doorknob turned. He poked his head in, squinting in the strange, crimson light. "Whoa. It's like a submarine in here." He saw the look on my face, the dead enlarger, the scattered, undeveloped sheets of photo paper. He didn't need an explanation. He just took in the scene, his usual buoyant energy, softening into something focused and serious. "Project due tomorrow?" he asked. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Okay," he said, as if it were the simplest problem in the world. "Okay, let's think he wasn't a photographer. He probably thought aperture was a typo. But he was an engineer, a builder, a problem solver. For the next 3 hours, he sat with me on the floor, armed with a tiny screwdriver set from his desk and a flashlight held between his teeth. He took the thing apart, piece by piece, muttering about capacitors and faulty wiring, while I explained, haltingly, what each part was supposed to do. He listened with an intensity I'd never seen from him before. He didn't fix it, not completely, but he managed to jury-rig a connection, bypassing the fried switch with a tangle of wires that was probably a fire hazard, but it worked. The bulb flickered to life. I had 5 hours until my deadline. "You're a lifesaver," I breathed, the relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. He just grinned, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek. "Nah, just good with puzzles. You'd better get to it." He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "Hey, when you're done, I want to see them." The pictures, it wasn't a demand, just a simple statement of interest. No one had ever asked to see my work before. Not like that. Not with that genuine, uncomplicated curiosity. That was the beginning. That night, a door I hadn't even realized was closed had been gently pushed open. He had seen me in my quiet corner of the world and hadn't looked away. He'd walked right in. From then on, the architecture of our friendship began to build itself. It was a slow, sturdy construction. It started with him leaving a cup of coffee outside my door on mornings when he knew I'd been up late printing. It grew into late-night conversations in the kitchen, leaning against the counters while the rest of the house slept, talking about everything and nothing, his coding frustrations, my struggles to capture a particular feeling on film. He became the subject of my photos, not as a posed model, but as a study in motion and light. I have hundreds of images of him from that time. Alex laughing on the sagging front porch, Alex asleep on the living room couch with a textbook on his chest, Alex staring thoughtfully into the middle distance, a half-empty mug in his hand. He was endlessly, effortlessly photogenic, not because he was classically handsome, though he was, but because he was so alive. My camera loved him, and, somewhere along the way, so did I. It wasn't a sudden lightning strike. It was more like a slow developing process in the darkroom of my own heart. A feeling that emerged gradually, ghost-like at first, then gaining clarity and definition until it was an undeniable image. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he'd throw a casual arm around my shoulders. It was in the way I found myself cataloging the tiny details of him. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way he'd chew on his lower lip when he was concentrating, the exact shade of gold in his eyes when the sun hit them. I loved him. It was a fact as solid and real as the camera in my hands. And it was a fact I knew I had to keep locked away, stored in the most secure, light-proof vault of my being. Our friendship was too important. It was the central pillar of my life, the one constant in the shifting landscape of my early 20s. He was my best friend. He was straight. He had a string of bright, bubbly girlfriends who were all variations on a theme: energetic, outgoing, uncomplicated. women who were like him, women who were sunlight. I couldn't risk the quiet, essential shelter of our friendship for a love that had nowhere to go. So I became an expert in emotional concealment. I built walls, reinforced them, and learned to live comfortably within their confines. My love for him became a part of my internal landscape, a secret garden no one else ever needed to see. It was beautiful, and it was mine, and it was safe. For 6 years, it was enough. The catalyst for the great shift, the event that would eventually lead to a Tuesday night and a devastating question, was named Sarah. She was Alex's longest relationship, a year and a half of what appeared, from my observational perch, to be perfect compatibility. She was a landscape architect, as bright and grounded as he was, and they made sense together. They looked good in photos. They hosted barbecues. They planned trips. I learned to navigate the particular ache of seeing them together, a dull, familiar throb I could mostly ignore. I was happy for him, or at least, I told myself I was. His happiness was a priority, even if I wasn't the source of it. I thought they would get married. I think he thought so too. Their end wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, structural collapse. I watched it happen in fragments. Alex grew quieter. The easy light in his eyes dimmed. He started working later, spending more time at the office, a place he'd always been eager to leave. He'd show up at my apartment, a small, quiet one-bedroom I'd gotten after graduation, my sanctuary, looking frayed and exhausted. He wouldn't talk about her, not directly. Instead, he'd talk about work stress, about a difficult client, about feeling burned out. But I knew it was more than that. I could see the fault lines spreading. The breakup, when it finally happened, was quiet. He called me on a Wednesday night. "She's gone," was all he said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual warmth. "Gone where?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Just gone. She moved her stuff out this afternoon while I was at work. Left a key on the counter." There was no anger in his voice, just a profound, empty shock. The kind of shock that comes not from a sudden blow, but from watching something you thought was solid rock crumble into dust in your hands. "I'm coming over," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't protest. When I let myself into their, now his, apartment, it was eerily silent. The spaces on the walls where her art had been were like pale, rectangular ghosts. The bookshelves were half empty. The air itself felt thin, depleted. He was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared life. He didn't look up when I came in. I didn't say anything. There were no words that could fill a void that large. I just sat down on the floor across from him, my back against the couch, and waited. We sat like that for hours, in a silence that was heavier than any conversation. As the sun went down, casting long shadows across the room, he finally spoke. "She said I wasn't there," he whispered to the floorboards. "She said it felt like I was a million miles away, even when I was sitting right next to her. Like I was searching for something. And she knew I wasn't going to find it with her." He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a bewildered pain. What the hell was I searching for, Leo? I had no answer. But in that moment, a terrifying, treacherous seed of hope, one I thought I had long since buried, began to stir in the dark soil of my heart. I was the person he called. I was the one he wanted to sit with in the wreckage. In the weeks that followed, my apartment became his refuge. He was a ship torn from its moorings, and my quiet, predictable life was his only port in the storm. He'd come over after work, exhausted and adrift, and just be. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want distraction. He just wanted proximity. He just wanted not to be alone. And I, the quiet observer, the keeper of secrets, just let him. I let him fill the quiet spaces of my home with his sadness, with his restless energy, with his profound, unspoken need. I made him dinner. I made sure he had coffee in the morning if he'd crashed on my couch. I became his anchor, and I tried, with every ounce of my self-control, to ignore the fact that I was slowly, terrifyingly, drowning. Because having him there, even broken and lost, was a kind of painful, secret bliss I had never allowed myself to imagine. The foundation of our friendship was still there, solid and deep. But the ground was shifting beneath it, and new, unfamiliar structures were beginning to rise in the spaces between us. The ritual began subtly, as most life-altering habits do. It started with him falling asleep on my couch. It wasn't a planned thing. We'd be watching a movie, or I'd be editing photos while he tapped away on his laptop, the silence companionable and easy. And at some point, his typing would slow, then stop. His head would dip. I'd glance over and find him completely gone, his face relaxed in sleep, his laptop precariously balanced on his knees. The first few times, I'd gently wake him. "Hey man, you should probably head home. Or at least to the bed." He'd startle awake, looking disoriented and groggy. "Oh, right. Sorry." He'd gather his things with a clumsy weariness and shuffle out, leaving the apartment feeling suddenly, overwhelmingly empty. His absence was a physical presence, a cold draft where his warmth had been. Then one night, he was utterly spent. He'd had a brutal week at work, navigating the fallout of a project his ex-girlfriend had been involved in. He arrived at my door looking like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He barely spoke, just collapsed onto the couch and stared blankly at the wall. I put on some ambient music, made him a cup of tea he didn't touch, and sat in my armchair, pretending to read a book. An hour later, he was asleep, his breathing deep and even. I looked at him, at the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, and I didn't have the heart to wake him. I gently lifted the laptop from his lap, placed it on the coffee table, and draped a blanket over him. I turned off the lights and went to my own bed, my heart a frantic, muffled drum against my ribs. The knowledge that he was sleeping just one room away was an electric current under my skin. It felt both profoundly right and dangerously wrong. When I woke up the next morning, he was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked rumpled and still tired, but something of the deep, hollowed-out look was gone. "Morning," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Sorry for crashing. I just couldn't face my empty place last night." "It's fine, Alex," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Anytime." And with those two words, a new rule was written into the silent constitution of our friendship. Anytime. It became his standing invitation. Crashing on the couch became a regular occurrence, maybe once or twice a week. It was our unspoken arrangement. He needed a sanctuary, and I was providing it. That was the official story, the one that was safe to tell. The truth, the one that lived in my churning gut and my racing pulse, was far more complicated. I was curating a museum of these moments, each one a precious, painful artifact. I knew the exact weight of the blanket when I draped it over him. I knew the soft, wheezing sound the couch cushions made when he settled into them. I knew the way a stray lock of his hair would fall across his forehead, and I had to physically restrain my hand from reaching out to brush it away. The ritual escalated on a cold night in November. A freezing rain was sleeting against the window panes, and the wind howled with a desolate sound. Alex had been at my place since dinner. We'd eaten takeout on the floor and were now on the couch, watching some mindless action movie. He was quieter than usual, a deep, melancholic stillness about him. About halfway through the movie, he shivered, a full-body tremor. "God, it's freezing in here," he muttered, pulling the thin throw blanket tighter around his shoulders. My apartment was old, the windows drafty. I got up to turn up the thermostat, but it was already as high as it would go. "It's this old building," I said, returning to the couch. "The heat is aspirational." He gave a weak smile. He shivered again, and then he did something that stopped my breath. He looked at me, a silent question in his exhausted eyes, and then he just moved. He unfolded his long limbs and shifted across the cushion, closing the small gap between us. He curled onto his side, facing me, and rested his head on the arm of the couch, his back pressed lightly against my side. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. I could feel the warmth of him through my shirt, the solid line of his spine, the slight rise and fall of his back with each breath. He had crossed a line, a small one, but a line nonetheless. He had initiated a new kind of physical contact, one that wasn't a fleeting, casual touch. This was sustained. This was deliberate. My mind went into overdrive, a frantic search for a plausible, platonic explanation. He's cold. He's just seeking warmth. It's like huddling with a sled dog in a blizzard. It's purely functional. It means nothing. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I tried to focus on the movie, on the car chases and explosions, but it was impossible. My entire consciousness had collapsed into the points of contact along my side. I was hyper-aware of the texture of his t-shirt, the way his shoulder blades moved when he shifted slightly. He let out a soft sigh, a sound of profound relief, and seemed to melt into the space beside me. After a few minutes, his body, which had been tense, went slack. His breathing deepened. He was asleep. He was asleep, pressed against me. I sat there, ramrod straight, for the entire rest of the movie. I didn't move a muscle. I was a statue, a living monument to unspoken longing. My arm, trapped between my body and the back of the couch, started to go numb, a pins and needles sensation spreading up to my shoulder, but I didn't care. I wouldn't have moved for anything. This proximity was a fragile, precious gift, and I was terrified that any movement would shatter it. This became the new ritual. He wouldn't just fall asleep on the couch anymore. He would fall asleep against me. It always started the same way. A shiver, a quiet, tired sigh, a slow, deliberate migration across the cushions until he was tucked against my side. And every single time, I would freeze, my body a riot of panic and bliss. I would analyze every detail. Did he press closer this time than last time? Was that sigh one of simple tiredness, or something more? It was a form of exquisite torture. I was his human hot water bottle, his emotional support animal. That was the role I was playing, and it had to be enough. I was so terrified of scaring him off, of making him feel uncomfortable, that I never once acknowledged it. I never wrapped an arm around him. I never rested my head on his. I simply provided a solid, unmoving presence for him to lean on. I was a wall, a pillar, a piece of sentient furniture. The final, most terrifying escalation of the ritual happened about a month later. It was late, after midnight. He'd been working on a massive project launch and had been running on fumes for weeks. He looked like he hadn't had a real night's sleep in a month. He'd stumbled into my apartment, dropped his bag on the floor, and announced, "I can't. I just can't." He didn't even make it to the couch. He just slid down the wall in my hallway and sat there, head in his hands. I brought him a glass of water and sat on the floor with him for a while, not talking. Eventually, I coaxed him up. "Come on, man. You need to sleep in a real bed." "Can't go home," he mumbled. "Too empty. Too quiet." "You can take my bed," I offered immediately. "I'll take the couch." It was the obvious, logical solution. He looked at me, his eyes glassy with fatigue. "No, you won't. You've got that shoot early tomorrow. You need to sleep." He paused, and the air grew thick with a new, terrifying possibility. "The bed's big enough, right?" My heart stopped. It literally just stopped beating for a second. The silence that followed his question was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a cavernous, echoing silence filled with everything I had ever felt for him, everything I had so carefully hidden away. My apartment had a queen-sized bed. It was, technically, big enough. But the space between technically big enough and what he was suggesting was a chasm a million miles wide. This wasn't the couch. This wasn't seeking warmth during a movie. This was a deliberate choice to cross a boundary that had always been sacrosanct. This was a bedroom. A bed. "Yeah," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. "It's big enough." I felt like I was moving through water as I went through the motions of getting ready for bed. I gave him a spare toothbrush. I pulled on a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt. My mind was a blank, white noise of panic. He was in the bathroom, and I could hear the water running. I got into bed, clinging to the extreme far edge, my back to the center, my body as rigid as a board. I was creating a clear, unbreachable border, a demilitarized zone. This side is mine. That side is yours. We are just two friends sharing a mattress for logistical reasons. That's all this is. He came out of the bathroom and turned off the light, plunging the room into a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the thin slice of moonlight coming through a gap in the curtains. I heard the rustle of clothes, and then the bed dipped as he got in on the other side. He was also clinging to his edge. There was a solid 3 feet of empty space between us, a no-man's land of sheets and blankets. "Night, Leo," he said, his voice quiet in the dark. "Night, Alex," I whispered back. I lay there, staring into the darkness, my eyes wide open. I listened to the sound of his breathing, trying to gauge his state from the rhythm. Was he asleep? Was he awake, staring at the ceiling, just like me? The silence was deafening. Every tiny sound, the creak of the floorboards, the distant siren, the hum of the refrigerator, was magnified. An hour passed, maybe more. I was convinced he was asleep when I heard him shift. The sound of fabric sliding against fabric. The bed dipped slightly as he moved. He was rolling over, away from me, A part of me sagged with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. But he didn't stop. He kept moving, slowly, cautiously, across the no-man's land. I felt the mattress shift behind me. I held my breath. And then, I felt it. A hesitant, tentative warmth against my back. He had moved all the way across the bed and pressed himself lightly against me, just as he did on the couch, spooning me, his front to my back. My whole body went up in flames. This was different. This was 1,000 times more intimate, more intentional than the couch. In the dark, in a bed, there were no excuses. There was no plausible deniability. There was only this. The solid warmth of his body against mine. The feeling of his knees tucked behind my own. And then his arm. His arm came around my waist, his hand resting gently on my stomach. It wasn't a tight grip. It was a light, questioning touch. A placement. His breathing was a warm puff of air against the back of my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was trapped, not by his arm, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of the moment. This was the culmination of every ritual, every unspoken gesture. This was the final, terrifying step. He had, in the safety of darkness, closed every remaining inch of space between us. And I, in my rigid, silent terror, had let him. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound, as if he'd been holding his breath forever. His hand on my stomach relaxed. His breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had found his harbor, and I was the harbor. I lay awake for the rest of the night, his arm around me, his body a warm, solid presence behind me, and I felt like I was going to shatter into a million pieces. The sun would come up. The darkness that gave him this courage would fade, and I had no idea what we would be when the light returned. That night established the ultimate form of the ritual. It was no longer about the couch. If he was staying over, it was an unspoken assumption that he would take my bed. And I, in a silent act of complicity, would take it with him. I would get in first, always taking my designated side, and he would follow. And every single night, after a few minutes of feigned distance in the dark, he would roll over and curl up behind me, his arms settling around my waist as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We never spoke of it. Not once. In the morning, we would wake up, tangled together, and pretend we didn't notice. He would get up first, clap me on the shoulder, and say something like, "Coffee's on you," as if we'd just woken up in separate twin beds at summer camp. The daylight brought with it a mandatory amnesia. The intimacy of the night was a dream we were both pretending we couldn't remember. This duality was tearing me apart. By night, I was the object of a profound, physical intimacy that fed every secret hope I'd ever nurtured. I would lie there, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back, his hand resting on my stomach, and I would feel a sense of peace so deep it was almost painful. It felt like coming home. But by day, we were just friends. Good friends, best friends, but friends. The whiplash was brutal. I was living in a state of constant, high-alert analysis. I dissected every conversation, every look, every casual touch, searching for clues, for some sign that the nighttime version of us was the real one. He gave me nothing. His daylight persona was as cheerfully platonic as ever. It was a masterful performance of denial, and I was his unwilling, silent co-star. I felt like a scientist studying a strange, beautiful, and possibly dangerous new form of life. I was collecting data, forming hypotheses, but I was terrified to conduct the final experiment that would prove or disprove everything. Because if I was wrong, if my interpretation was just wishful thinking, the fallout would be catastrophic. I would not only lose the hope that was currently keeping me alive, I would lose him. I would lose the friendship that was the bedrock of my world. So I stayed silent. I played my part. I let him use me as his anchor, his human security blanket, and I pretended it didn't mean a thing. The breaking point arrived, as I suppose it had to, on one of those Tuesday nights. It was raining again, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the city lights outside my window. We were on the couch, the television off for once. The only light came from the dim lamp in the corner, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. We were just talking. The conversation had meandered from his work to a book I was reading to an old college memory. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation that had been the hallmark of our friendship for years. But underneath it, the tension was still there. It was always there now. A low hum of unspoken things. He had fallen silent, his gaze distant. I knew this mood. It was the precursor to one of his deep, existential spirals. I waited. He was tracing the seam on the couch cushion with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. He turned to look at me, and that was when his eyes dropped to my mouth. The air shifted. The comfortable quiet became a thick, charged silence. My pulse began to thrum in my ears, a frantic, familiar rhythm. Here we go. The precipice. He held my gaze for a long moment, his own filled with that same raw, unfiltered vulnerability I'd seen once before. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall but exhausted by the climb. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper. "If you like someone." The question landed in the center of my chest like a stone. It was the same question from before, but this time it felt different. It was heavier, more pointed. He wasn't just asking a philosophical question. He was asking me. He was staring at my lips and asking me to define the very thing I had been hiding from him for 6 years. My mind raced, a chaotic flood of possible answers. Do I give him the clinical, psychological answer? Do I give him a vague, poetic one? Do I tell him the truth? The truth. The thought was terrifying. The truth was a weapon that could either save us or destroy us completely. I don't know, Alex. I stammered, my throat dry. I guess you just do." It was a weak, pathetic answer. A coward's answer. He didn't seem to hear me. His focus was absolute. "No, but how do you know?" He pressed, his voice softer, more insistent. "Is it a feeling? Is it just that you want to be around them all the time?" He was describing us. He was describing the last 3 months of our lives. "Is it that you can't sleep unless they're there?" My breath hitched. He was narrating our secret ritual, bringing the nighttime truth into the stark light of the living room. He was confessing without confessing. He was asking me to give him permission. I couldn't speak. I could only stare back at him, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could see it. The space between us crackled with a static energy. It was the moment of truth, the final experiment. I could deflect. I could make a joke. I could change the subject. I could retreat to the safety of our platonic fortress one last time. Or I could stay. I could hold his gaze. I could let the silence stretch until it became an answer in itself. I chose to stay. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just held his gaze, and in my eyes, I let him see everything. The years of longing, the fear, the hope, the profound, overwhelming love. I took down every wall I had ever built and let him see the secret garden I had tended in silence for so long. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a flicker of something, recognition, understanding, and then terror, the sheer, animal panic of a man realizing he is not who he thought he was. He had walked, blindfolded, to the edge of a cliff, and I had just taken the blindfold off. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. His gaze flickered from my eyes, down to my lips, and back up again. He was wrestling with a choice so monumental it seemed to be physically shaking him. The moment stretched into an eternity. The rain tapped against the glass. A car passed on the street below. And then, with an infinite, excruciating slowness, he began to lean in. It wasn't a confident move. It was hesitant, questioning. A movement of inches that felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. He was giving me every possible chance to stop him, to turn away, to break the spell. I didn't move. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips against mine wasn't a kiss. It was a question, a soft, tentative pressure, a moment of stillness where the world stopped spinning. It was just the barest, lightest contact, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. It was confirmation. It was real. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a misinterpretation. This was happening. He pulled back, just a fraction of an inch, his eyes still closed. I saw a single tear trace a path from the corner of his eye down his temple. He let out a shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh of relief. And then he leaned in again. This time it was a kiss. It was gentle. It was achingly soft. There was no passion in it, no demand. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. It was 6 years of unspoken words. It was the quiet grief of his breakup and the terrifying hope of something new. It was the comfort of all those nights spent pressed together in the dark. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was a beginning. My hand, which had been clenched into a fist on my lap, came up and rested on his cheek. I felt the wetness of his tear against my thumb. He melted into my touch, his lips parting slightly against mine. It was the most heartbreakingly beautiful thing I had ever felt. We stayed like that for a long time, in the warm, golden light of my living room, while the rain fell outside, washing the world clean. The crossing had been made. There was no going back. We were in a new country now, and the only map we had was each other. The aftermath was not the gentle unfolding I had hoped for. I had imagined a morning of soft words, of quiet understanding, of finally being able to look at each other without the heavy filter of ambiguity. I had imagined peace. What I got was a deafening silence. When I woke up the next morning, the space beside me in the bed was empty and cold. I sat up, my heart sinking with a familiar, dreadful weight. I listened. The apartment was still. Too still. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. His bag was gone. His shoes were gone from their place by the door. A clean coffee mug sat upside down on the drying rack, the only evidence he had been there at all. He had left. He had run. He had left before I woke up, without a word, without a note. The beautiful, fragile country we had discovered last night was already abandoned. I was its sole, stranded inhabitant. A cold, sharp pain, a mixture of humiliation and fear, settled in my chest. Had I imagined it all? Had the kiss been a mistake? A moment of grief-fueled confusion on his part that he now deeply regretted? My mind, my greatest enemy, began to supply 1,000 cutting explanations. I was a momentary lapse, an experiment, a convenient, warm body he had used to soothe a deeper ache that had nothing to do with me. The kiss hadn't been a beginning, it had been an ending. The final, definitive proof that I had allowed my own desperate hope to project a meaning onto his actions that simply wasn't there. I spent the day in a fog of misery. I canceled my shoot. I couldn't bear the thought of trying to capture beauty in the world when my own world felt so ugly and broken. I paced my apartment, replaying the kiss over and over, searching for the flaw, the clue I had missed. But all I could remember was the softness of his lips, the wetness of his tear, the feeling of his hand on my waist. It had felt real. It had felt like a surrender. My phone remained silent. I checked it obsessively, my thumb hovering over his name. Should I call? Should I text? What would I even say? Hey, did that life-altering kiss we shared last night mean anything to you? Or were you just momentarily insane? Every option felt fraught with peril, layered with the potential for more hurt. By evening, the pain had curdled into a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, for running away without a single word of explanation. But mostly, an anger at myself. For 6 years, I had successfully managed my feelings. I had kept them safe. I had protected our friendship. And in the last few months, I had let the walls crumble. I had let hope in, that treacherous, beautiful weed. And now I was paying the price. He had forced a choice, and then fled from the consequences. It wasn't fair. I couldn't live in the silence. The uncertainty was a poison, seeping into every corner of my mind. I needed to know, even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine. I needed to hear it from him. I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment, my heart pounding a furious, determined rhythm. I walked the 10 blocks to his apartment, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the fire in my gut. When I stood before his door, I hesitated. This was it, the point of no return. I could still turn around, go home, and try to piece my silent, lonely life back together. But I knew I couldn't. The ambiguity had finally become more painful than any potential truth. I took a deep breath and knocked. It took him a long time to answer. I could hear movement inside, a soft shuffling. I knocked again, louder this time. Alex, it's me. Open the door, finally. The lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. He stood there, backlit by the light from his hallway, looking like a cornered animal. His hair was a mess. He was wearing the same clothes from the day before. He looked like he hadn't slept. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Leo, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? The anger I had been suppressing flared up, hot and sharp. You disappear. You run away after last night, and you ask me what I'm doing here? You don't answer your phone. You just vanish. What the hell did you think I was going to do? He flinched, leaning back from the door as if my words were physical blows. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't know what to do. You could have talked to me, I said, my voice rising. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, forcing him to take a step back. I wasn't going to have this conversation in a hallway. You could have just said something. Anything. Instead, you sneak out like a thief. Do you have any idea how that feels? To wake up to that. To an empty bed and a ghost. He finally looked at me, and his face was a mask of pure misery. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, panicked confusion. I know, he said, his voice cracking. I know, and I'm so sorry. I freaked out, Leo. I woke up this morning, and you were there, and it was the most right thing I've ever felt in my life. And it terrified me. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a small, frantic circle in his entryway. What is this? What am I doing? I'm not. I don't. I've never. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have the words for it. He had spent his entire life on a clearly marked road, and he had suddenly found himself in a completely different country, with no language and no map. You've never what, Alex? I asked, my voice softer now. The anger was draining away, replaced by a vast, aching sadness for him. For both of us. You've never felt this way about a guy? About me? He stopped pacing and stood before me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He nodded, a small, jerky movement. I just keep thinking about Sarah, he said, his voice thick with shame. What she said, that I was always searching for something. I think maybe this is it. I think maybe it's always been you. He said the words like a man confessing to a crime. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for what? Forgiveness? Absolution? For me to tell him it was okay. And that terrifies you. I finished for him. It terrifies me, he confirmed, his voice breaking. Because I don't know who I am anymore. And because I've spent the last 3 months using you. I was so lost, so lonely, and I took what you were offering. I took your warmth and your quiet and your strength, and I didn't let myself think about what it meant. I just took it. And last night, I kissed you. I crossed that line, and I dragged you over it with me. And what if I'm just confused? What if this is just some messed up reaction to the breakup? It's not fair to you. To do that to you. There it was. The heart of his fear. Not just the fear of his own identity shifting, but the fear that he was hurting me. That he was using me. The thought was so misguided, so utterly wrong, that a laugh, sharp and humorless, escaped my lips. He looked wounded. What's funny, Alex? I said, stepping closer to him, closing the space he had so desperately tried to create. You think you've been using me? I reached out and put my hand on his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. For 6 years, I have been in love with you. For 6 years, I have watched you with other people, and I have smiled, and I have been your friend, and I have buried everything I felt for you so deep I thought it would never see the light of day. These last few months, they haven't been you using me. They've been the closest I have ever come to getting what I've always wanted. It has been beautiful, and it has been absolute torture. But it was never, not for 1 second, you using me. His face crumpled. The last of his defenses fell away, and he just broke. A raw, ragged sob tore from his throat, and he collapsed forward, his forehead resting against my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him up. He clung to me, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. He was mourning the person he thought he was, mourning the simplicity of the world he used to know. And he was terrified of the new one he was just beginning to discover. I just held him, my own tears blurring my vision. I held him in the middle of his stark, empty apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of his past life, and I felt the jagged edges of our conflict begin to soften. The fear was still there. The uncertainty was still a vast, uncharted ocean. But for the first time, we were facing it together. The silence had been broken. The real conversation, the one that had been happening in whispers and shadows for months, had finally begun. The resolution wasn't a single, cinematic moment. It was a slow, quiet process of reconstruction. It was built not on grand declarations, but on small, intentional acts of honesty. After that night in his apartment, after the tears and the confessions, a fragile truce settled between us. He didn't run away again. But we didn't fall into an easy romance, either. It was tentative, like two people learning a new language, fumbling with the grammar of a shared vulnerability. He stayed at his place. I stayed at mine. The ritual of the shared bed was suspended, a tacit acknowledgement that we couldn't go back to the safety of its ambiguity. We needed to build something new, something in the daylight. We started with coffee. The next morning, he texted me. Just 3 words. Coffee at Fiore's? It was our old spot, a neutral ground from before everything had shifted. When I walked in, he was already there, at a small table by the window, 2 cups of coffee already waiting. He looked tired, but the panicked, haunted look was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by a quiet, sober apprehension. He was here. He hadn't run. That was enough. We talked for hours. He told me about the fear, the deep, unsettling feeling of his own identity being rewritten without his consent. He talked about his relationship with Sarah, how he'd loved her, but how it had always felt like he was performing a role he'd been cast in, one that never quite fit. He admitted that his pull toward me, his need for my quiet presence, had long predated the breakup, but he'd never had a name for it. He'd just classified it as best friendship, the most intense category he had available. And I talked. For the first time, I let him into my secret garden. I told him about the enlarger, about the moment I realized my camera loved him, and the slower, deeper moment I realized that I did, too. I told him about the ache of watching him with his girlfriends, about the quiet, painful joy of being his confidant. I explained the architecture of the walls I had built, and how his sadness had been the one thing powerful enough to breach them. It was a conversation of radical honesty, stripped of all pretense. It was terrifying, and it was liberating. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears and longings and confusions, and we just looked at them, together. "I don't know what this is exactly," he said, his hands wrapped around his cooling coffee cup. "And I can't promise I won't be a mess sometimes. I feel like I'm starting from scratch." He looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. "But I want to find out what it is. With you. If you're willing to be patient with me." "I've been patient for 6 years, Alex," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "I think I've got a little more in me." And so we began. Slowly, we went on dates. Actual, intentional dates. A movie where we sat side by side and I felt the giddy, teenage thrill of his fingers tentatively finding mine in the dark. A walk through the botanical gardens where he'd stop and point out a plant, and I'd take a picture of him, bathed in the dappled sunlight, and the act of capturing his image felt new again, charged with a different meaning. He started staying over at my apartment again, but it was different. The first time, after a late dinner, he stood awkwardly in my living room, the old pattern hovering in the air. "I should probably go," he said, but he made no move to leave. "You can stay," I said softly, "if you want to." "Okay," he whispered. That night, when we got into bed, there was no pretense of distance. There was no no-man's land. I lay on my side, and he lay on his, facing each other in the dark. He reached across the space between us and took my hand. His thumb stroked the back of my knuckles. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. No more assumptions. No more ambiguity. Just a question. "It's okay," I said, my heart swelling with a quiet, profound joy. He moved closer, and I met him in the middle. He didn't curl up behind me. He faced me, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me against his chest, burying his face in my hair. I wrapped my arms around his back, holding him tight. We weren't hiding in the dark anymore. We were finding each other in it. We were learning to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The peace I had been searching for didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped in, slowly, like the morning light. It was in the mundane moments that the real magic happened. It was in waking up to find him already awake, just watching me, a soft, wondering look on his face. It was in making coffee together in the kitchen, our bodies moving around each other in an easy, familiar dance. It was in sitting on the couch, my head on his chest, his arms securely around me, his chin resting on the top of my head, and feeling nothing but a deep, unshakable sense of rightness. The constant, frantic analysis in my brain finally quieted. The observer retired. I didn't have to document the moments anymore. I could just live in them. One Saturday morning, months later, I was in my small darkroom, the red light bathing everything in its otherworldly glow. I was developing a new series of photos, portraits of him I had taken over the last few weeks. Alex smiling into the camera, his eyes bright with a light I hadn't seen in years. Alex concentrating, his brow furrowed as he worked on his laptop at my kitchen table. Alex asleep, his face peaceful and unguarded, in my bed. The door opened, and he stepped in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He navigated the cramped space with a practiced ease and stood beside me, watching as I gently agitated a tray of developer. An image was beginning to emerge on the paper, a ghost becoming a reality. It was a photo of him, taken just the day before, laughing on my fire escape. He leaned his shoulder against mine, a familiar, comforting weight. "How do you know?" he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble beside my ear. "When it's going to turn out okay?" He was talking about the photograph, but we both knew he wasn't. I looked from the image taking shape in the chemical bath to his face, illuminated in the soft, red light. The face I had loved in secret for so long, and the face I was now learning to love in the open. The lines of anxiety were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense of peace that mirrored my own. The answer was no longer a mystery. It wasn't a complex philosophical puzzle. It was simple. It was right here. "You don't," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder, the smell of coffee and developer filling the small, dark space. "You just trust the process. And you wait for the picture to come into focus. And in the quiet safety of our shared darkness, surrounded by the images of our new life, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that our picture finally had. We were in focus. We were home.